Snow fell like ash from a broken sky, heavy and unrelenting, draping the mountains in a silence that could smother the living. Inside the cabin, the air was brittle with cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and dimmed the flame of the heart. She lay on a narrow cot pushed against the wall, her breath shallow, her lips cracked from thirst. One hand, trembling and pale, rested upon the curve of her belly, the only proof that life still clung to her. Each exhale left a fragile cloud in the dim light, vanishing as quickly as it came, like a spirit on the edge of departure. The cabin had been meant as a refuge, a place hidden from wagging tongues and eyes sharp with judgment. Yet here, in its solitude, it became a prison. The shutters rattled with each gust, and the chinks in the log walls hissed with wind. A tin cup, empty and overturned, lay forgotten near her feet. Hunger was no stranger now. She had grown accustomed to the hollow ache, but weakness spread through her limbs like a creeping frost. It was not the winter alone that had undone her. Months before, when autumn leaves still burned gold, she had been abandoned. A man had promised forever and vanished with the first frost, leaving behind a belly swollen with his child and a heart fractured by betrayal. She had walked through town once more after he left, head lowered beneath her bonnet, and the stares had cut deeper than any knife. Women whispered of sin, men turned their faces, and the preacher's wife closed her door without a word. Pride had carried her up the mountain trail. Pride and shame tangled like briar vines, until her feet led her to this cabin, where no one could judge her except the empty wind. But pride could not warm her, nor could it still the fear that woke her in the night. Alone, she listened to her own heart, steady but frail, and wondered if it would stop before the child's first cry. More than once she pressed her hand to her belly, whispering promises to the little one, promises she doubted she could keep. The storm thickened. Snow pressed itself against the door, rattled loose shingles overhead. She closed her eyes, sinking into half sleep, half delirium. In her haze, she thought she heard footsteps crunching outside. She told herself it was the storm's deceit, the shifting of ice and wood. But the sound came again, closer, deliberate. Her eyes fluttered open just as the latch stirred. A figure entered, bringing with him the sharp sting of winter air and the scent of pine. He filled the doorway like a shadow carved of the mountain itself, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a coat dark with melted snow. His beard was rimmed with frost, his eyes steady as if accustomed to weathering silence. For a moment, she believed death had come for her in human form. He said nothing. He set down the bundle he carried, an armful of wood, and crouched by the hearth. With practiced hands, he arranged the logs, struck flint, and coaxed the flame into being. Sparks leapt, fire caught, and light crept into corners long starred to warmth. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, torn between fear and gratitude, unable to lift her voice. The stranger glanced at her once, his gaze brief but searching, as though he weighed whether she would last the night. He did not ask questions, did not demand explanation for her presence in this forsaken place. Instead, he placed a small tin pot upon the fire, filling it with snow scooped from outside. The crackle of melting ice filled the silence. Her lips moved, though the sound barely rose above the wind. "Why?" The words slipped out, raw and broken. He did not answer, not with words. Instead, he poured the steaming water into the empty cup at her bedside and set it gently within her reach. His hands were rough, scarred by work, yet his movements bore the careful grace of a man who knew the weight of fragility. She tried to lift herself, her body rebelling, but managed to sip. Warmth spread down her throat like a promise, and tears pricked her eyes, not for the water alone, but for the kindness it carried. Still, she did not trust him. The memory of betrayal was too fresh, too sharp. Every kindness felt like the shadow of a cost yet to be revealed. She turned her face to the wall, shielding herself behind silence. If he was offended, he did not show it. The hours stretched. The storm raged, battering the cabin, but within, the fire grew strong. He mended the loose shutter with nails pulled from his own pack, patched the gap where the wind howled, and stacked wood neatly against the wall. Each act was small, unspoken, but together they stitched life back into the hollow place she had called home. She studied him when she thought he would not notice, the way he moved with patience rather than haste. The way he never lingered on her swollen belly, as others had. The way he left space between them, as though he knew the shape of grief and would not intrude upon it. When he finally settled on the floor near the hearth, leaning back against the wall, the room seemed to breathe differently. The storm's howl softened, the fire whispered steady. She felt, for the first time in many nights, that she might see morning. Yet fear still gnawed. She wondered what he wanted, why he had come, why he remained. She could not yet believe in selfless presence. In the world she had known, men did not stay. Men left. Men judged. Men used. And so she clung to suspicion even as warmth returned to her hands. Sleep crept over her, reluctant but irresistible. Before her eyes closed, she whispered again to the child within, a vow spoken into firelight. Hold on. Just hold on. Outside, snow kept falling, erasing tracks, swallowing paths. The world beyond the cabin disappeared beneath its white veil. Inside, two strangers sat in a fragile truce, one too weak to rise, the other too silent to leave. Between them, the fire flickered, carrying the first fragile thread of a bond neither had yet chosen but both, in their own broken ways, needed. And in that thread, in the hush of storm and heartbeat, the story of survival began to take shape. The fire had burned low by the time dawn sifted through the cracks of the shutters. Pale light touched the cabin, washing the rough-hewn walls in gray. She stirred on the cot, her breath still uneven, but her eyes opened more fully than the night before. For a moment she forgot he was there. Then she saw him by the hearth, tending the flames with the same quiet focus he had carried through the storm. He had not left. That alone unsettled her. Men in her life had come with promises and gone with silence. Yet this one sat on the floor, cross-legged like some sentinel carved of stone, his coat still damp, his boots crusted with snow. He was a stranger, and she could not name what tethered him here. He offered her a tin plate with a heel of bread and strips of dried venison. She eyed it warily, suspicion flickering in her hollow gaze. Still, hunger pressed harder than pride. She took it, her fingers shaking as she lifted the bread to her lips. The taste was coarse, dry, but to her starved body it was as sweet as honey. "You'll need strength," he said at last, his voice low, rough as gravel. It startled her, the first words he had given her. She chewed slowly, studying him. There was no judgment in his eyes, no curiosity, only a plain truth. She was weak, and he meant her to endure. She resented him for it, not for the food nor the warmth, but for the way his presence reminded her of her own frailty. She had built walls from shame and solitude, and here he was, steady as a mountain itself, seeing her in her most helpless hour. Her pride ached worse than her bones. When she turned her face away, he did not press. He rose instead, ducking through the doorway into the storm. She listened to his boots vanish into the snow. For a breath she thought he might not return, and a strange panic rose in her chest. Panic not of abandonment, but being thrust again into that terrible silence. Yet before the fire waned, he came back, his arms heavy with another bundle of wood, his beard rimmed in frost once more. The hours passed like that. He worked in silence, patching cracks with moss, melting snow for water, mending the shutter that had beaten itself loose in the wind. She watched him through lowered lashes, her thoughts tangled. He seemed to carry the storm on his shoulders without complaint, his hands moving with practiced strength. It struck her that he was a man accustomed to solitude, to work without praise, to weather without comfort. When evening came, the fire cast a warmer glow upon the cabin walls. She found herself listening to the small sounds of his labor, the scrape of wood, the faint hum of breath through his beard, the shift of boots across the floor. The silence between them changed its weight. It was no longer the silence of death creeping close, but the silence of something unspoken, tentative, waiting. Still, she clung to distrust. Each time his eyes flickered toward her, she turned away. She remembered the laughter of the townsfolk, the whispers carried on cold streets, the way her former lover had left her with nothing but a child and disgrace. She would not be pitted again. Better to endure frost than charity. Yet charity was not what he gave. His actions were too plain, too unadorned to carry the air of pity. He did not speak of her belly, did not ask questions, did not soften his work for show. He simply stayed. And though she fought the thought, part of her began to wonder if staying might be its own kind of mercy. That night, as the storm raged harder, he spread his blanket near the hearth, leaving her cot untouched. She watched him lie down, his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling with slow breaths. A strange comfort stole over her. For the first time in many nights, she slept without the terror of not waking. In the days that followed, the rhythm of their lives found shape. He left each morning for wood or snares, returning with the smell of pine clinging to his coat. She mended what she could. A torn seam in her dress, a frayed edge of blanket. Her hands, though weak, longed to be useful again. She noticed how he glanced at her work, not with correction, but with quiet acknowledgement, as though each small act marked a return to the world. One evening, as she stirred broth in the tin pot, the kettle sputtered and hissed, sending steam across the hearth. It whistled high, shrill, like a startled bird. She startled, then laughed, soft, brief, but unmistakable. The sound surprised her as much as him. She covered her mouth, ashamed, but when she risked a glance, she found him looking at her with something lighter in his eyes. Not amusement, not mockery, something steadier, something almost warm. That moment lingered. She felt like a spark between them, not spoken, not claimed, but real, and with it came a flicker of fear, not of him, but of herself. For she had vowed not to trust again, not to let her heart stumble where it had been broken. Yet the quiet company of this mountain man, his silence, his patience, began to wear at her resolve like water against stone. She told herself it was only necessity. He brought wood. She needed heat. He brought food. She needed life. That was all. But when he returned one evening with a rabbit strung at his belt and snow clinging to his beard, she felt something shift. Relief. Relief that he had come back. That his boots once more thudded across her floor. And she hated herself for it. One night, the storm pressed hard against the cabin, snow driving at the door as though it meant to break through. She lay awake on the cot, listening to the wind scream. Across the room, he sat at the fire, sharpening a knife with slow strokes, steel against stone. The rhythm was steady, almost calming. She watched him, his face lit in flashes by the flames, and felt a strange safety in the sound, as if the very act of his persistence could keep the world from collapsing. Her lips parted, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Why do you stay?" The question hung in the air, sharp as the wind outside. His hand paused on the blade, but only for a breath. Then he set aside and looked into the fire. "Because you're here," he said simply. Nothing more. No explanation, no demand. Only those 3 words. She turned her face into the pillow, her heart pounding in her fragile chest. Tears stung her eyes, though she fought them back. She had longed for words once, for declarations that promised forever. But those promises had crumbled. Now, it was a simplicity that undid her, the weight of a truth spoken without ornament. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, the silence between them deepened, richer than before. She closed her eyes, not in despair this time, but with a new thought trembling in her heart. Perhaps survival was no longer hers alone to bear. And so the fire burned and the space between strangers grew smaller, though neither dared yet to name what it was becoming. The snow had begun to loosen its grip when he finally told her they must ride down to town. Supplies had dwindled, and no matter how he stretched them, the cabin could not sustain both of them and the child she carried. She resisted at first, her heart thudding with dread. The thought of walking among those who had turned their backs on her tightened her throat like a noose. Yet she knew he was right. Hunger was a truth that could not be denied. The trail was slow, the horse steady beneath them. He rode with her seated before him, his arm firm across her to shield her from the cold. The town rose out of the snow like a wound in the wilderness, smoke curling from chimneys, roofs sagging under winter's weight. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, wishing she could vanish into it. Every step closer set her chest burning with old shame. They passed the first houses, and already she felt the eyes upon her. Curtains shifted. A woman sweeping her porch stilled her broom, mouth pressing thin. The blacksmith, arms like tree trunks, glanced once, then spat in the snow as though to cleanse himself of the sight. She lowered her head, cheeks aflame, praying that if she did not meet their gaze, she might be spared the sting of their judgment. At the general store, he dismounted first, lifting her down with gentleness that betrayed no hurry. She swayed on her feet, unused to standing so long. He steadied her, then stepped inside with her close at his side. The warmth of the store did not ease her trembling. Conversation fell quiet the instant they entered. A pair of women by the bolts of cloth turned their backs sharply. A man near the stove shifted, muttering beneath his breath. The storekeeper, an old fellow with spectacles low on his nose, looked from her swollen belly to her face, then to the mountain man at her side. He said nothing, but the hesitation in his voice as he greeted them spoke louder than words. She kept to the corner while he gathered flour, salt, and beans. Each rustle of cloth, each scrape of boot upon the floor, seemed to magnify her shame. Whispers pricked her ears like thorns. Ought to have known better. No ring, no husband. Dragged up the mountain like some stray. Her chest tightened. She remembered too vividly the night she had walked these same streets, her pride crumbling beneath their stares, the words that clung to her like burrs she could never shake. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall here. She turned her gaze to the floorboards, tracing the grooves where countless boots had worn them down. Through it all, he said nothing. He did not quicken his steps, did not bristle at the whispers. He stood at the counter with calm surety, laying down coin with a steady hand. His silence was not cowardice, nor was it ignorance. It was a shield, and though he never moved closer than he always had, she felt its shelter wrap around her. When the parcels were packed and tied, he carried them as though they weighed nothing. He did not look left or right, did not acknowledge the eyes upon them. Instead, he touched her elbow gently, guiding her toward the door. The warmth of his hand steadied her more than she wished to admit. Outside, the air was sharper but freer. She breathed deep, as though only beyond those walls could she draw a full breath again. He helped her mount, and once they were clear of the town's edge, she dared glance back. The roofs huddled against the snow, smoke still drifting upward, windows glinting with the gaze of those who would always see her as less than whole. She hated them, but more than that, she hated the way their words still reached her heart. The trail home was quiet. The horses' hooves sank deep into the slush, the only sound between them. She kept her eyes on the trees, the branches heavy with ice, afraid that if she spoke she might unravel. At last she whispered, barely audible, "They will never forget, never forgive." His reply came after a long silence, his voice steady, as if carved from the same earth as a mountain. "Then let them talk." She turned her head slightly, searching his face. He did not meet her gaze, but the certainty in his tone was enough. He did not measure her worth by the gossip of the town, nor by the man who had abandoned her. He saw her only as she was, weary, but still standing, still fighting to draw a breath for herself and the child she carried. Something shifted within her then, a flicker, fragile but real. Perhaps dignity was not granted by others. Perhaps it could be claimed, even in the face of scorn. Back at the cabin, she moved with new purpose. She stitched a tear in her shawl, humming under her breath though her voice trembled. She swept the floor with slow strokes, watching the dust curl away like old ghosts. Each task was small, but each felt like defiance, like proof she was not broken beyond repair. He watched her without comment, his expression unreadable, but she sensed his quiet approval in the way he lingered near, in the way he stacked wood with greater care than before, in the way he stirred a fire until it glowed bright against the dark. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind ease outside. The shame still lived in her bones, but alongside it now lived something else. Not pride, not yet, but a beginning of it. The seed of a truth she had nearly forgotten. That survival was not only endurance, but the stubborn choice to keep standing no matter who turned their eyes away. She placed her hand on her belly, whispering again to the life within. "We will not bow," she murmured, and for the first time the words did not feel like a plea. They felt like a vow. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. He sat near it, sharpening his knife in steady strokes, his presence as constant as the mountain itself. She watched him until her eyes grew heavy. Outside, the night held its silence. Inside, dignity began to take root in the hollow where shame had lived too long. The thaw came slow, but the storm did not. Snow lay deep against the cabin walls when her time arrived, sudden and merciless, as though the blizzard itself had called it forth. The wind screamed at the shutters, rattling them like bones, and within, her cries joined the storm. She clutched at the blanket, knuckles white, every breath a battle between despair and resolve. The child inside pressed hard against life's threshold, and she feared she would not survive the crossing. He was at her side, steady as ever, though she saw the shadow of fear flicker in his eyes. His hands, built for axe and rifle, worked with awkward gentleness. He boiled water, tore cloth into strips, pressed her hand when the pain bent her near in two. He spoke little, but his presence filled the room, anchoring her as the storm tried to tear her apart. The hours stretched, marked only by firelight and the rhythm of her labor. Each contraction rolled through her body like thunder, leaving her trembling, gasping for air. She wanted to give up, to let the darkness take her, but each time her strength faltered, she felt his hand close over hers. Rough, scarred, unyielding, his silence carried more promise than any words she had once believed in. "Stay with me," she whispered once, voice broken as her body shuddered. "I will," he answered, simple and sure, as though nothing on earth could drive him from her side. The storm pressed harder. Snow hissed against the roof. Fire roared in the hearth, and within the small room the battle for life reached its peak. She screamed until her throat was raw, until her body was nothing but fire and breaking. Then at last the cry came, not hers, but the thin, piercing wail of a newborn child. For a breath, silence fell. The storm raged on, but within the cabin, the world stilled. He placed the child in her arms with a reverence that stilled her trembling. Tiny fists waved, eyes shut tight, lungs protesting their new place in the world. She wept, her tears falling onto the downy head, her sobs a mingling of exhaustion, pain, and something greater than both, relief, wonder, the return of her own pulse. He stepped back, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the moment. The firelight caught his face, softening the lines carved deep by solitude. He looked not at her, nor at himself, but the child, as though the world had shifted beneath his boots. For a long time neither spoke. The cabin held only the crackle of flames and the newborn's cries, sharp and fragile, alive. She clutched the child close, heart pounding with the truth of survival. For weeks she had feared she would not see this moment. For months she had carried shame heavier than any burden. Yet here, in the arms of a man who asked for nothing, she had crossed through the storm and come out whole. When she raised her eyes to him, she saw no triumph, no claim, only quiet devotion. He crouched then, his large hand smoothing the ruffle of the cradle he had built from scraps, sanding edges with care. He set it near the fire, not speaking, his actions the only language he needed. She understood. Love was not in promises that vanished with the first frost. It was in this, staying, tending, giving without demand. Her breath caught, not from pain but from the swell of something she had long forgotten. Hope. It stirred in her chest, fragile but real. She had been broken down by judgment, left hollow by betrayal, but dignity rose again, built not by the town's forgiveness but by her own survival, and by the steadfast hand that had refused to leave her to die. The storm began to ease. The howls softened, the weight of snow settling instead of raging. Within, the cabin glowed warm, alive with a new presence. She leaned back against the cot, the child against her heart, and closed her eyes. He sat across from her, knife in hand, smoothing another piece of wood as if the act itself kept him grounded. She studied him through half-lidded eyes, seeing the man beneath the silence, one who had weathered solitude until it became part of his skin, who carried strength not as a weapon but as a shield. She realized then that she did not fear him, nor the bond that had grown between them. It was not a chain, but a rope cast into the storm, drawing her back from the edge. The fire crackled, shadows danced, and she thought of the town below, with its sharp tongues and shuttered windows. Let them talk, let them turn their backs. She no longer needed their measure. Here, In this cabin on the mountain, she had found her worth. She pressed a kiss to her child's brow, whispering words only the newborn could hear. Promises not of riches or acceptance, but of resilience, of life carved out against the storm. She would not bow. She would not break. Her gaze lifted to him once more. He met it, and for a moment, words were unnecessary. Between them passed an understanding, deep and unspoken. They had walked through fire and snow and come out together. Whatever came next, they would meet it side by side. The child's cries softened into sleep. The storm beyond the cabin faded into hush, and the night settled like a blanket over them all. And so it ended not with thunder nor with triumph, but with quiet, quiet that held more power than any roar. In that stillness, a truth was born alongside the child. That love is not always found in grandeur, nor in vows shouted from rooftops. Sometimes it is found in the steady courage to remain, to weather another storm, to build a fire and stay until the thaw. Remember this, reader. The world may strip you down to hunger and shame, may cast you out into the snow with nothing but your breath. But if a hand reaches through the storm, steady, unafraid, you may yet rise again. And in that rising, you may find that what seemed an ending was only the first breath of a new beginning.